and rack. Your accessories will come in a plastic bag, and here they are on the bench. Highlighted as a battery balancer, the rack attachment hardware, the battery holder bolts to hold the battery to the rack, the tail light brackets for replacing the standard tail light locations, cable ties to ensure everything stays correctly in place. First step is to put up your scooter on a bench or a work stand, which will enable you easy access to the modifications and fitment of the rack and battery extender. We use a little bungee cord with magnets on each end to stop the front wheel from turning around by itself. It just keeps everything secure and stops the cables getting twisted. Once you've got everything balanced right, we'll go ahead and remove the brackets on the rear which hold on the mudguard, and also the rear brake light and tail light assemblies. Unplug these and remove them, put them aside for later. Every scooter comes with a diagram which shows you the drilling locations. It is vitally important that you drill these locations correctly using the attached drawing. In this shot, I've used the drawing to make up a template out of a manila folder cardboard. I've marked everything, and now I'm center punching the drilling location so everything is really accurate. Once completed on one side, you go to the other side and finish the job. Then drill the holes for the rack. Here I'm just doing some 5mm holes, which I will then put the rack on and double check that they're drilled in the right location before proceeding with the full job. It's important to countersink these to remove any swath that's on the frame, which will cause problems when fitting. Now, a really important thing. Normally, you'll get supplied with 5mm bolts, but I prefer to actually drill out at 5mm and then tap the holes at 6mm. This is my own personal modification. I believe it gives more strength than the standard method, but either method is okay if you have access to the correct tooling. If you are just using the supplied bolts and you don't need to tap out the hole, you can leave it at 5mm. When finished, clean everything up to remove all of the waste. Protect the top of the mudguard from scratching using a piece of foam that's left over from the packaging. Now we can test fit the rear bracket assembly, which holds the battery in place. Be careful when doing this to stop anything getting scratched. We need to remove the battery from the battery holder. So put in the key and turn it anti-clockwise, and then I find it easier to use a flat-bladed screwdriver just to release the battery from the battery holder itself. It makes it easier when installing. There are 7 bolt hole locations which hold the battery rack onto the battery holder itself. You need to remove the one bolt that's already in place. This will split the battery holder into 2 parts. So it's Phillips head on one end and an 8mm socket on the other end. Once you've removed the guide, you can then go ahead and put the battery holder into the battery rack so it will hold the battery securely. Position it in place with the one bolt already in place. Put the battery holder in correctly. You'll need to lift it up and fiddle a little bit to get the bolt through, but when in place, put the nut on the other side. Once we've done this, we can then go ahead and insert the other 6 nuts. I've spread up the sequence here, inserting the bolts and the nuts. Just do them loosely to start with. And once they're done loosely, then look at the rack from behind and line up the battery guide so it's in the middle. There's about 4 or 5 millimeters sidewards movement in the battery holder, and if you don't have it positioned correctly, the battery will hit the side rails when it gets inserted. Once satisfied, we can go through and nip everything up. It doesn't need to be over tightened, just firm. We're now attaching the rack permanently to the bike frame. So we put the bolt through, we then put the spacer in place, and in this case I forgot to use a little dollop of Loctite. And the little dollop was actually a big dollop, and you don't need much Loctite, so I'm going to spread it onto a second bolt. So the bolt goes through the frame and then through the spacer, and then I'm aligning it on the frame with the hole that I drilled and tapped earlier. If you didn't go ahead and tap this hole, you can just use the bolts that have been supplied with the kit and just put them straight through. I prefer to use the 6mm bolts rather than the 5mm bolts because I believe it gives it a little bit more strength. Once you have one side in place, go around and do the other side. Keep everything loose until everything is permanently attached, and then go through and tighten them correctly then. Okay, all 4 bolts are in place, and I'm going to go through and just nip them up. You may notice that the mudguard on the back is actually touching the frame. That is okay because the mudguard usually springs up when you take off the rear stays, so don't worry about that too much yet. Once all 4 bolts are in place, we then need to go and fit the nuts. Because of the bolt size we're using, there's no need to fit a washer. Just fit the nut and then tighten everything up firmly. Sometimes there's not much room to get these inside nuts in place, so just take your time and get everything up nice and firm. Go ahead and put the nuts on all 4 locations. This next image shows you a close-up of how everything is. So from the outside we have the bolt head, the washer, the frame, the spacer, and then a nut. Now that the rack is held firmly in place, we can go ahead and remove the foam packaging, because we won't be scratching the mudguard any further. Using the cable ties supplied, position the cable which goes from the rear battery all the way through to the controller box. There are 4 locations for the cable ties to be fitted, and you'll see little inserts welded onto the frame to make this happen. It's important to keep everything nice and straight when doing this. Try not to have one cable overlapping the other cable. Keep it tight for the best fitting results. Once everything's in place, using some cutters, go through and remove the extra cable tie that's not being used. Now it's time to fit the rear mudguard frame and the brake light brackets in place. Just get everything aligned firstly, do the connection to the brake light, and then push the brake light into place and then firm everything up. We're now doing the electrical part of the installation, so we remove the bottom plate from the scooter. In this position we've turned it upside down with the rear rack on some carpet, and the front handlebars on a box. There are 6 screws in total holding the base plate to the tricycle. Remove the plate, and underneath you have the battery, which I'm just lifting out now, along with the controller box and the electrics at the front. Remove the controller box and try to pull out and identify which cables you need to disconnect and connect to. Firstly, however, we need to pull through the power supply leads from the rear battery through to the controller box area. It's really easy if you have a second person to help, but in this case I'm going to pull a few more wires through so I can gently lay the battery over the side of the frame. You don't really need to be worried about damaging the battery cables here because everything is in a really strong cover. The most important part of doing this is to make sure you have the cables correctly routed through the entry port in the back of the battery bay, and all of the cables have to be underneath the metal tape and secured in place. If they're just flopping around or they're running over the top of other cables, there won't be enough room for the battery to sit flat, and that means you won't be able to close the battery cover correctly when the job's finished. When peeling off this aluminium tape, you need to be pretty careful because it can get easily torn and damaged. Again, the cables can't be twisted, everything has to be laying flat. Once you've managed to work it all the way through to the front cavity, you can then lay the aluminium tape back down and secure everything in place. Now comes the electrical hookup. We've identified which cables need to be attached where. So we've attached the rear battery cable to one side of the battery balancer, and the other end there goes into the internal battery, which is already fitted into the scooter. The third and single wire goes to the controller. So the connection of the battery balancer is pretty straightforward. You can then slide the battery back in place, and it will take a bit of digging around and moving things, but you need to go through all of the cables, sort them out and get them positioned nicely so they're laying flat and everything can go back together again. This can be a little bit fiddly, so just take your time. Try not to use screwdrivers or anything to push on the cables in case you cause some damage. Once we have everything back in, the bottom plate can go back on. Firstly, go through and put in the 6 screws that hold the bottom plate in place. Then get all of the alignment done, usually by pushing it forward, and then go through and tighten up the bolts for one last time. Explaining how this battery balancer works is quite important. So you can see here at the top of the image we've got the 2 batteries going through the balancer in the middle of the image. On the bottom left is a battery charger, and on the bottom right is the controller. When we're using the battery charger, power goes through the balancer and then goes out to both of the batteries. It supplies the correct amount of electricity to both batteries. In this image you'll see that both batteries are at 50% full, and the job of the battery balancer is to keep everything in balance and charge using a single charger. We've left it on the charger for a bit longer and now everything is full, so the battery charger will turn off once both batteries are full and they're balanced. We then go to the discharge cycle. Here you'll see both batteries are going through the battery balancer and to the controller which powers the scooter. Both batteries now are at 50% and the battery balancer is keeping them both balanced throughout the discharge cycle. Eventually, both batteries will be completely discharged, they'll be flat, and the power going through the controller will eventually drop off and you'll need to recharge again. Without the battery balancer, this can't be done. On the bottom right hand side of the scooter below the deck is the on and off switch and also the charging port. The rear battery also needs to be turned on. You can tell that it's turned off by pressing the capacity button on the back and none of the lights come on. Underneath the rear of the battery is the main power switch to turn the rear battery on and off. We recommend leaving it on all of the time. There's also a built-in battery tail light switch which you can use for added visibility and safety, and there is a 45 amp slow blow fuse which protects the rear battery system. The rear battery also has a standard USB outlet charger. You will see a charging port on the rear battery. This is a 3-pin XLR port, but it is not used for charging. There is only one charging port on the scooter, and that is on the location below the rear deck. When you charge through this port, you will be charging both batteries through the battery balancer at the same time. If you don't do this, it will cause you a lot of problems. There are 2 chargers available for the scooter when you've got the extended battery pack. You can continue to use the standard 2 amp battery charger, which will take you at least overnight to recharge from empty, or you can purchase the optional 5 amp battery charger, which will recharge everything in about 6 hours. Operation of the extended battery is pretty straightforward. Leave the rear battery on at all times. You can just operate the scooter then using the on and off switch on the right hand side of the deck and the control button on the keypad. That's it, it's pretty straightforward. You'll get about 80 to 90 kilometres of range minimum, depending on your rider weight and riding habits.